Celiac disease can be devastating to those who suffer from it. The immune reaction to eating items with gluten can damage the small intestine, and this leads to medical issues. Due to advances in research and treatments, individuals with celiac disease now have many options of maintaining quality of life. Today on At the Forefront, we'll talk about ways families can live with celiac disease through a gluten-free diet. Join us as our experts take your questions. That's coming up right now on At the Forefront. And we want to remind our viewers that today's program is not designed to take the place of a visit with your physician. We're going to start off with having each one of you identify yourselves, introduce yourselves to the audience, and tell us a little bit about what you do here at UChicago Medicine. And Dr. Verma, let's start with you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm Ritu Verma. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. I am the section chief for pediatric gastroenterology, hepatology, and nutrition here at the University of Chicago. I'm also the medical director of the Celiac Center here in Chicago. Besides that, a few other hats, but for today's purpose, this is what I do.
You're a busy person. Let's go over to Anna. Anna is in the other part of the studio. We're still trying to make sure that we socially distance ourselves during the program, so Anna's over there. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here at UChicago Medicine?
Yeah, hi. It's good to be here today. My name is Anna Velazquez. I'm a pediatric celiac disease dietitian here at our Celiac Disease Center. And so one of my roles here is to see patients in our clinical visits, but I also help support the Celiac Center in hosting our monthly events, as well as some of our support groups, and then initiating new programs, and then keeping up with our social media as well.
You mentioned monthly events and support groups and things like that. We'll talk more about that as the program progresses, but I think that's one of the neat things that we do here at UChicago Medicine, and it's kind of that approach, that big umbrella approach for our patients, where we meet them in a lot of different areas and try to take the best care of them as possible here at the institution, and I think you all do a wonderful job with that. So let's start with Dr. Verma, and we're going to get some of the basics kind of out of the way first as we discuss celiac disease. What exactly is celiac disease? I mentioned a little bit in the intro that basically there are issues with the small intestine, but I'm sure you can give a much better explanation than I did.
So Tim, I just wanted to say one comment about what we do here at the University of Chicago. I think it's really in our Department of Pediatrics, and I'm sure the others would say the same, is we have a family-oriented process for any chronic illness. So I know we're talking celiac, but truly any chronic illness is thinking about the child, the family, and really having a multidisciplinary approach. Yeah. So having said that, what is celiac disease?
Sure.
So celiac disease, is an autoimmune disease, and people would say, well, what is an autoimmune disease, right? So it's different than an allergy. It's not an allergy, but it's a condition which affects your immune system, affects your intestines, and also affects the rest of your body. So it is, again, quite common. Some people may have heard about it, but it's almost in 1 in 80 people that you actually end up with celiac disease. Wow. So quite common and different than an allergy.
That's interesting. That's a much higher number than I would have anticipated.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, we talk so much about gluten in so many different aspects that maybe perhaps we don't give the name celiac disease to certain symptoms and conditions.
Now you bring up gluten, so some people have gluten allergies. Is that the same thing as celiac disease, or is there a little bit of a difference here?
A big difference.
Big difference.
So when you think about gluten, so gluten has 3 things in there, and Anna will talk more about that in terms of wheat, rye, and barley. But under that umbrella of gluten-related disorders, you have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease. So people who have celiac disease, you eat gluten, it gets damage to your intestines, and it affects the rest of your body and your immune system. It's a lifelong condition. You cannot have any traces of gluten in your diet because it leads to other complications in life. With an allergy, again, the diagnosis is made by an allergist, so you could have reactions, hives and things like that, like people talk about from a peanut standpoint, and you can use EpiPen if it's an allergy. And then you have gluten sensitivity, which is different than these 2 conditions, which I think most people talk about is I'm sensitive to gluten. And in that case, you could have very similar symptoms to celiac disease, but the long-term autoimmune, chronic, debilitating sort of complications that happen with celiac disease don't happen with gluten sensitivity. So a big difference in terms of lifestyle and what you're going to do for the future.
So with an autoimmune disease like celiac disease, is the small intestine, is it actually damaged?
Yeah, so in people who have celiac, every time you eat gluten, it actually causes damage to the lining of your small intestine, and that is only the beginning of the damage, because what happens as a reaction is occurring in your intestine. So there's an autoimmune reaction that occurs. There are cytokines and interleukins that are produced in with this reaction, which then affect the rest of your body, and that's what really makes it that autoimmune part of it.
So let's talk about symptoms a minute, because we hear a lot about this, but I think there are probably some misconceptions as to, if you really do have it, if you don't have it. What are some of the symptoms, and if you do have some of these symptoms, what do you need to do? I would imagine come and see someone like you.
See someone like us, or even talk to your pediatricians, your primary care doctors, and so on. So symptoms can be so variable, and that's what really makes it difficult sometimes to make a diagnosis. So it used to be said, you have to have weight loss and you have to have diarrhea to make that diagnosis, and what we've seen is that truly you don't need weight loss and you don't need diarrhea. And in fact, now there are more people getting diagnosed who actually have constipation, who are doing really well with their weight. Some people might even be a little bit overweight. So the symptoms are variable. So usually we'll say, think about your body from head to toe, and really any symptom can be affected with celiac disease. So going from head to toe, hair loss, alopecia, chronic headaches, thyroid issues, bone as far as osteoporosis and so on, which is not explained by either your age or your diet. Then going further down, your hepatitis, it can involve your liver, anemia. Those are kind of things that get affected. And then older, obviously outside the pediatric age, we hope, infertility, those are things that you would see that with celiac disease as well.
I had no idea that celiac disease could have that much of an impact on a person's body. That's incredible.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's hard sometimes to think about celiac disease and look for celiac disease. So I always say, if you have a symptom that you cannot explain by another condition, or it's a chronic symptom, not the first headache. So when you're done watching this segment and you get a headache, doesn't mean you have celiac disease. But chronic headaches, when you have chronic headaches.
You've watched the show before.
So if you have chronic headaches, and you don't have an explanation for that, think about it. And you asked about how do you diagnose it. It's a blood test. It's a blood test that you get done to get started. So your primary doctor can order that blood test. However, if you're not sure of what blood test to order, give us a call. Just give us a call and we'll help in terms of what blood test to order. Fantastic. With that.
I want to bring Anna into the conversation, because Anna plays, I think, a very important role in what your team does as well. And it's fascinating to me because you've just described all of these symptoms and potential things that can happen, but there are treatments, and that's the good news, and Anna's going to talk to us a little bit more about that. Anna, can you start off with talking about a gluten-free diet and how critical that is, and then we'll get into specifics?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current treatment for celiac disease is the gluten-free diet. And so you may be wondering, what is gluten? Gluten is a protein, and that is found in 3 grains, wheat, rye, and barley. And so really, gluten is just an umbrella term for different proteins in those specific grains. For wheat, it's gliadin and glutenins. For rye, it's secalin, and for barley, it's hordein. And so what all those grains have in common is they have this protein fraction, gliadin, in there, which is the actual part that the immune system responds to and reacts to. And so the gluten-free diet, we want to exclude the 3 grains that do have gluten in them. And so those are wheat, rye, and barley. And so another thing to consider is that there are different names for these grains. So for example, for wheat, it can also be known as bulgur, matzo, couscous. Barley is also known as malt. And then one really important and last component of the gluten-free diet is the oats. Although the oats do not have gluten in them, they are very often grown, harvested, transported, and then sorted together with gluten-containing grains. And so the risk for cross-contact is great. And so when we recommend oats, we just want to make sure that they are gluten-free as well.
That's interesting. So even if they are transported or have some kind of contact with those other grains, they still potentially could be dangerous.
Yes, exactly. And that's just the nature of how we process and manage grains.
Well, and as you're going through that list, and we talk about those 3 grains, those 3 grains are used in everything. I mean, you see those in foods across the gamut, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. So wheat is very often used in many different things, including soy sauce, and then things like spices as like a thickener, for example, in a taco seasoning. Malt can be and is very often used as a flavoring as well. And then barley and rye can also be used in non-food products.
Well, that's a huge challenge then, because I think when people think of gluten, they think of bread. You know, okay, I can't eat bread anymore, or I can't eat pasta or whatever. But you mentioned all these other things that soy sauce, for example, I would have never even guessed that.
Yeah.
That's really difficult then for people.
And that's a challenge, honestly, when you think about from a celiac standpoint, just like you said, take away bread, okay, I can live without bread,
Yeah.
maybe. But when you have to start reading the labels and looking at cereal and, something like Rice Krispies, for example, you would think it's rice, okay, you should be able to have it. It's rice, is not gluten. But the Rice Krispies, the cereal itself has malt in it, so you cannot eat that. And so that is the struggle of having to live with this condition, where currently the only treatment we have is a gluten-free diet.
So that's the perfect segue to the next question then. If you're in a household and you have someone who is suffering from celiac disease in that household, I mean, the question I was going to ask is, does the entire household need to be gluten-free? And it sure sounds like that would make life a lot easier if it was. I don't know, your thoughts on that, Anna?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily recommend for the whole family to go gluten-free. And so there are different reasons for that recommendation. One of them being is when someone does start the gluten-free diet, sometimes the diet can lack certain nutrients, which is why we recommend that someone with celiac disease be followed by a physician and a dietitian. And so if someone doesn't have celiac disease and they start the gluten-free diet, it might not be the most nutritious option for them. We also don't want to exclude any members who don't have celiac disease, because that's a really important part when we do talk about quality of life.
So when we talk about quality of life, there are things you can do in your home, and I think we have a video that John shot with you a week or two ago. John, let's go ahead and roll that video, and then we'll come out and we'll kind of discuss some of the things that you show us in the video, Anna.
Hi everyone, my name is Anna Velazquez. I'm a dietitian at the University of Chicago, specifically our Celiac Disease Center. One of my main roles here at the center is helping to support patients with celiac disease in managing their gluten-free diet, in helping implement 504 plans, and also managing their day-to-day activities like going to school, seeing friends, moving on to college, and just going through different stages of their life. So today, what I have with me is a few props from my own kitchen in which I was hoping to show how we can establish a dual kitchen for families who are trying to separate gluten and gluten-free foods in their kitchen. So first and foremost, there are few things in your kitchen that you will like to have separate or two of in your kitchen. So one of the first things is a toaster. Because we put the bread into the toaster, a lot of the crumbs tend to fall down. It's really hard to clean, and it's not something we run through the dishwasher or even periodically wipe. So we want to make sure that we have two of. Now, there are different ways to kind of keep this separate. You can either do a label, like I have here, I made it orange, or you can just get a completely different color and know everyone in the family agrees that this is going to be orange is the color for gluten-free. Another thing that we want to get a separate of is a cutting board. By nature, cutting boards tend to get a lot of creases in them, a lot of cuts, which can harbor gluten particles. So we want to make sure to have a separate one for all the gluten-free cooking and cutting that you're doing. Another item that we do want to make sure you have a second of is a strainer. So when we do strain pasta, because the holes are so tiny in here, it's really hard to clean sometimes, and after using it so many times, it really is hard to kind of get them out. So just as a precaution, we want to have a second one. And just like with the toaster, I did put a little rubber band that is orange here, so it does help to distinguish it from the other strainer that may be using regular pasta. And this really can be a tactic to use for other things that you prefer to have separate or two of. And so rubber bands are a great way to do that, especially for things with handles. And then anything that is, not going through the water, is not going to be touched with water, can be labeled with a sticker, a circle, anything that is convenient for you and your family. Other things to have separate of, if you do not have a dishwasher and you are hand washing dishes, having a separate sponge. So as you can see, this sponge is very porous. There's a lot of holes in it, and so when you are scrubbing or washing something, the gluten particles can kind of get in there and then they just stay in there. So having two of is fantastic, just so when you make foods that have gluten on them, you use the gluten sponge, and when you make foods that are gluten-free, use the gluten-free sponge. One last thing that we do recommend kind of keeping separate of or having two of is anything that is wooden. So this applies to cutting boards or even something like I have here. It's a wooden cooking spoon. Wood is very porous, and so it just goes back to it harbors gluten particles, and we want to make sure that it doesn't stick in there, and that you have something that is safe and can be thoroughly cleaned. So those will be things like on this side, things that we can share. So anything that is stainless steel, solid aluminum, things that are not easily scratched and can be used between gluten and gluten-free cooking. Now, it's important to mention that we do want to thoroughly wash these dishes and things that we do share in between cooking. So if you are in a rush and you can't clean in between, make the gluten-free foods first, and then you can use those same pans for gluten-containing foods. Other things that we can share, you can run through the dishwasher or thoroughly wash in the sink, are things like metal cooking utensils, or even just utensils to use that you eat with, knives, forks, and spoons. Other option would be glass, and all the ceramics can be shared as well. They can be thoroughly cleaned, they're not porous, and then are an excellent thing to share, so it's less expensive and also easier in terms of storage, because it is very hard to have two of everything. And then one last thing I did want to mention, kitchen rags are a common thing, and it really depends on what you use them in the kitchen for. If your family likes kitchen rags to kind of wipe their hands on while you're cooking, or it's you're making a sandwich and you kind of just like, yuck, I got mayo on my hand, and you wipe it on the rag, that's when it's also best to kind of have this two of, and so you can have an orange one for the gluten-free, and then a gray one for gluten cooking and baking and such. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked when trying to create a dual kitchen in your home is, how do I organize these foods? How do I combine gluten-free and gluten-containing foods and make sure that my family member with celiac disease stays safe? So one really good trick is to think about it in terms of crumbs and cross contact. How to prevent it from touching and from any crumbs falling one on the other. And so one way to do that is to always keep your gluten-free foods on the top. And so this really applies for your pantry, for your fridge, and for anything that you're putting in the oven at the same time. So as you can see right here, this is just a demo of what your pantry may look like. And this could be either an actual pantry, this could just be a cabinet, or this just could be a kitchen cart that you have on the side. And so these are mostly dry foods, but an example of a pantry would be having all your gluten-free foods on the top and all your gluten-containing foods on the bottom. And so the logic behind that is, if I were to take this muffin and put it on top here, and it's not very well secured or covered or contained, the crumbs might fall on all these gluten-free foods. And if someone doesn't close the package properly here, then those particles are really just going in there. And then when the person with celiac disease goes to make their gluten-free foods, it has been at that point cross-contaminated. So that's one way to keep things safe. The same logic can apply to the way things you arrange in your fridge. And same thing with anything that you're putting in the oven. So if you have a conventional oven, which is an oven without the fan in the back, you can actually bake at the same time gluten and gluten-free foods. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that the gluten-free food is on the top, and there's a clear layer on the rack, so nothing, so it's just safe and on the top. You don't want to put the gluten-containing food on the top because you don't want anything to fall during the baking process. If you have a convection oven, which is the one with the fan in the back, that one is a little tricky to cook at the same time. Even when you do put foods on the top, the fan actually spreads things around and moves the air, which can dislodge gluten particles from the bottom foods and kind of transfer them during the cooking process. If you do have an oven like that, baking at the same time is not out of the question if you just cover your food tightly, so there is no way of any particles or crumbs getting into it. That can be a solution as well.
And Anna, that was a great demonstration that really, I think, showed how people can make that work, although it does look like it could be challenging at times. And Dr. Verma, I'm curious to get your take on this. We talked a little bit about households not having to go gluten, but sometimes they do.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, you made a comment earlier, it might be easier just to have gluten-free household. So if a parent is stressed out and feels like having gluten in their home is just going to be too much to deal with. So it's totally okay when you're starting the journey of going on a gluten-free diet is that you can make your household gluten-free. If that mentally is going to bring you to peace, you could do that. But remember that if someone does not have celiac disease, as Anna mentioned, going on a gluten-free diet is not healthy for them, totally. And also remembering the quality of life of the family members who don't have celiac disease. So I think starting off, if someone feels very comfortable and saying, you know, while I'm learning this whole thing, let me have the diet, everyone go gluten-free, it's totally fine. Or if you have a child who's diagnosed who's 3 years old, so he or she is going to be probably picking things up from the floor, you know, the
Exactly,
5-second rule, the 2-second rule, whatever rule. So then again, it becomes much harder for parents. So the whole idea is really you want to have a good quality of life, and how do we really do that in conjunction, depending on what stage of life you're in and the journey of celiac disease.
You know, I think that's an excellent point. And Anna, I want to bring you back into the conversation as we talk a little bit about quality of life. And I don't know, can we talk about restaurants at all too? Because I think that's another area where it could be pretty challenging if you're in this situation or have a family member in this situation. What does a person need to do? Are you just done eating out, or can you still enjoy that?
You can absolutely still enjoy that. And so it does take more preparation and planning in order to go out. There are certain questions that we go through in clinic to make sure that you know how to approach these situations. So we do recommend that you call the restaurants ahead of time, ask certain questions, state that you have celiac disease, ask them what they can make gluten-free for you, and then think about it in terms of what you do at home. How do I make sure that my food is gluten-free and not cross-contaminated at home? And that's kind of the same principles you want to apply at the restaurant. It's always a great idea to speak to a manager or a chef who will likely be better able to assist you, and then make sure that different utensils, pots are being used to prepare your food, that employees are changing their gloves, and then ingredients are stored separately from each other, so there's no double dipping.
One of the things you mentioned in the video I thought was fascinating is the porous versus non-porous utensils, cutting boards, things like that. So I would imagine that's an area in particularly in the restaurant world where you would have to make sure that they are being careful, because those kitchens are busy places.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of time when restaurants are very busy, they do sometimes tend to try to save time and make things quickly and in the same pots or with the same utensils. So for example, Pasta is a really great example of this, when sometimes restaurants will have a boiling pot going, and they'll boil one batch of pasta and then use that same boiling water to make the second batch of pasta. And so in this case, we really want to make sure that the gluten-free pasta is made separately in a clean pot with a clean water.
You know, one of the things that is, I think, a real advantage to living in a major metropolitan area like Chicago, there are actual restaurants that specialize in gluten-free options or even an entirely gluten-free menu. And so, you know, those are obviously areas I think it would be well worth checking out. You can probably find some pretty good places to visit.
Yeah, and there are apps as well that you can use that help along with that. But I would totally agree with Anna that just because you have celiac disease doesn't mean that you cannot go out to eat.
Exactly.
And I have 2 children with celiac disease, and I hate cooking, so you could just imagine what would happen if there was no eating out.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Can we talk a little bit about affordable gluten-free food options? Because again, once you get to that point where you're starting to specialize your diet, I think people worry a little bit about cost options, and it can be expensive, but maybe Anna, you have some tips for us there?
Yeah, definitely. So when I do my initial first gluten-free diet education, I always want to remind families all the food groups that are not lost on the gluten-free diet. And so those foods will be things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, gluten-free grains, and then protein coming from animals, and then most dairy products as well. And so those products will be priced the same way as they are for people who are following a general diet. But then of course we kind of switch gears to all the snacks and packaged foods, because they do play an important role in our diets, especially for kids. And so this is kind of where it gets a little bit more expensive to kind of maintain and, you know, supply these snacks. And so for those, there are a lot of stores who are kind of coming out with their own gluten-free brands, like Aldi, or are carrying more brands at a more affordable price. And so those will be places like Target with Target Circle or Walmart. And so they do have better options as well. But in addition to that, I love coupons, and if you do too, I would recommend something like the gluten-free app newsletter. So that's the app where you can find the restaurants, but they do also send emails. And in those emails, they'll send regularly coupons as well as new product alerts, which is fun and a way to save.
That's really helpful, and that sounds like a great idea. So I've got to ask you, we hear about, you know, over-the-counter supplements, treatments, things like that. Does any of this stuff work? And I'll throw that one out to both of you.
Go ahead, Anna.
So for the supplements, it is something that we do recommend. When someone is first diagnosed with celiac disease, their absorption is decreased because the villi are flattened, and so they can't get as much nutrition. So in terms of like multivitamin supplementation, we do recommend that. And then of course we personalize it as we go through the diet and as someone recovers, because like I mentioned, sometimes the gluten-free diet may not include all the nutrition that kids need to grow. And so that's kind of where we lean on supplementation to fill in the gaps.
But as far as any kind of treatments or anything that you...
No, there's really no treatment. You know, I think when people talk about treatment for someone who's been exposed to gluten, it's more with the symptoms. So if somebody has abdominal pain, then you can have, you know, Tums or something for that kind of thing. But there's no medicine right now as treatment for celiac disease.
Yeah, and that's I think that's an excellent point, because some of those can maybe mask the symptoms, but that's not solving the problem.
Right. Right.
So I am kind of curious, as far as, do we see more celiac disease in men versus women, ethnicities that are more impacted, or is this just across the board and it hits everybody?
So women, girls, females more than males has been at least looked at with a higher risk. But ethnic background, any ethnic background. Again, it's one of those things when we talked about the symptoms, what we thought about from a celiac standpoint was also thought that celiac disease was only seen in the French Canadians or the Irish and so on, and it really is any ethnic background that you can be diagnosed with celiac disease. And these days, you know, everyone is intermarried, so what is there about what?
That's very true. Well, and and that's an excellent point, because you wonder, and I know science has advanced so much, but you know, years ago there were probably a lot of people that didn't get diagnosed or misdiagnosed and had to live in pain.
Yeah, and I think that some people don't want to be diagnosed. You know, it's like I want my beer, as I'm told by many dads. I want my beer, so I don't want to get tested. So I think it's not just a matter of that beer and pain; it's what the long-term risks can be.
I am not going to join the conversation on that one. So, how can we improve the detection rate?
I think months like this are good in terms of the awareness. So when you have a Celiac Awareness Month, then there's more and more discussion. The social media is out there, the parents are out there. So I think education, education, and education is important. And education to patients, families, and also to physicians, dietitians, and not just gastroenterologists, because this is a disease that really covers all specialties. So the education has to happen for everyone. And easy access to get the blood test done. I think it's the blood test that we all need to just get done.
Perfect. Well, this was a fantastic program. You two gave us a lot of information. I was certainly educated. There are a lot of things I learned today that I did not know, and I'm sure same with our viewers. So we are out of time. Thanks, special thanks obviously to our guests for being with us today, and a big thank you to those of you who watched. Please remember to check out our Facebook page for our schedule of programs coming up in the future. To make an appointment, you can go online at uchicago.org or give us a call at 888-824-0200. Thanks again for being with us today, and I hope everyone has a great week.